So thank you everyone for joining us tonight from all over the country. This is really exciting. Special thank you first before we get started to some of my colleagues. Lily, who you'll meet a little bit later, she'll participate in the Q&A, and Julie, Aaron, and Kim, who are helping with tech things behind the scenes. I'm Lauren Lasky. I'm the Vice President of Development at Coburn Place. Coburn Place is located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Our mission is to empower survivors of interpersonal abuse, and we envision a world where every human may live free from interpersonal abuse with safe and stable housing and an opportunity to enjoy overall well-being. Coburn Place is Indiana's largest and most comprehensive provider of longer-term housing options for survivors. We uniquely offer on-site transitional housing and community-based housing in a domestic violence housing first approach, targeted at identifying and eliminating housing barriers and improving survivors' overall housing stability, self-sufficiency. We are a nationally recognized model program and have provided life-changing support to more than 4,000 adults and children since 1996. For more information on Coburn Place, you can visit our website, which is www.coburnplace.org. Before we get started today, I would like to get started with a poll question for attendees. So Erin, if you could launch poll question number 1, please. If you work for a housing organization, what kind of housing do you provide? Emergency housing, transitional housing, rapid permanent housing, a mixture of those, or some other sort of housing that's not mentioned? And Erin, once you feel like we've had enough responses, you can close the poll. I see some people commenting in the chat that you provide a mixture. If you're able to vote on the poll, that would be wonderful. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of people that are here with other organizations that do provide a mixture of housing options. So that is great. Okay. So the main reason why I'm guessing a lot of you are here tonight is because Dr. Cris Sullivan is joining us. She really needs no introduction, but she has a lot of incredible experience and accolades. So I just want to share a little bit about her background with you before we get started. Dr. Sullivan is a professor of ecological/community psychology, and she's the director of the Research Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, and is a senior fellow of Michigan State University's Office on Outreach and Engagement. Her areas of research expertise include conducting longitudinal experimental evaluations of community interventions for abused women and their children, improving the community response to gender-based and evaluating victim service programs. Her research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institute of Justice, and foundations, and her work has impacted research, policy, and practice. So we are very lucky to have Dr. Sullivan here with us this evening to present her findings on transitional housing, and specifically the transitional housing program at Coburn Place. So Dr. Sullivan, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, thank you, Lauren, and thank you all of the wonderful staff at Coburn Place for helping to put this on, for being here to answer questions, and for participating in the documentation that we did last year, or might have even been 2 years ago now, of Coburn Place's transitional housing program. What I wanted to do today is just share with you all, if I can share my screen here, share with you some more specific information about why Coburn Place is a national model for transitional housing, so that we can just talk about what are sort of the key ingredients that maybe transitional housing programs need to succeed, to get a sense of how similar or different Coburn Place is to some of the other people on in this meeting today. So I just wanted to share with you. Not working here. There we go. So the goal of today's discussion is a couple of years ago, given Coburn Place's strong national reputation, a team and I wanted to learn more about what makes the program work. So that was Dr. Sudha Sankar and Ms. Emily Sheridan Fulton were the other team members. And how this started is Julia, the executive director of Coburn Place, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, contacted me to just ask more about what's the evidence around transitional housing and what are you hearing about what's working. And she started telling me more about Coburn Place and how it was working, and shared that Coburn Place keeps in touch with people after they leave. And she just sort of offhandedly mentioned that about 78% of the people leave Coburn Place and move into stable housing. And I remember saying to her, you know, that's a really, really high number of people. That's a pretty great percentage. And she didn't realize it was all that out of the ordinary. So it was based on that and our initial conversations. At that time, I was working with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, which I still am doing, trying to understand what are some best practices going on around the country. And especially at that time, we were interested in transitional housing because HUD had started cutting a lot of funds for transitional housing. And a lot of that was because of traditional housing homeless service providers were providing transitional housing differently than domestic violence service providers. But HUD wasn't making that distinction. They were cutting a lot of funding, a lot of DV programs around the country were getting their funding cut. And so it was really important timing to get out there and see where it is working, what's going on that's making this work. Because when transitional housing works well, I think it's a really important resource. So NRCDV, with some funding from Department of Health and Human Services, said we can come out there and document this process if you're open to that. And the staff were very, very open. We really appreciate that. It's never easy to have outsiders come in and sort of analyze and examine your program in depth. And that's what we did. So we looked at Coburn Place's program, protocols, manuals, and written documents. Because so much of how staff behave is related to what your program structures are, what they're allowed to do, what they're encouraged to do, what their training is, what the expectations are, what the philosophy of the program is, and whether that philosophy is sort of evident in all of the other documents within the organization. So we started there. We looked at their written documents. We then did staff interviews. So we did, in-person interviews with 14 key staff, basically just asking them about their work and what they thought influenced success of program participants. So we asked them how their work looked in reality. We asked for stories about different clients that they had worked with. Of course, they always maintained confidentiality when they shared those stories, but we really were trying to get in depth what was working and also where are their where are their problems? I mean, no agency will say we've got this down 100% and we never have any issues, right? And it's really important, I think, for the rest of us to hear what isn't going as well for programs that we're holding up as exemplars. And then we also interviewed 9 clients who either had recently left Coburn Place's transitional housing program or who had been in it for a long enough period of time that they could really talk about everything to do with their experience, what it was like to enter the program, their participation, what they thought were the outcomes in their lives based on Coburn Place, and recommendations they might have for change. So then we took all of that information, we looked at similarities and differences, we came up with a preliminary report of what we thought we were hearing and understanding. We then checked those conclusions with the staff. And we ended up concluding that there's really 5 pillars guiding Coburn Place's work that they think leads to their positive outcomes and that we would agree are what likely lead to their positive outcomes. So that's what I want to focus on today, is those 5 pillars. So to start with, the first pillar, the first 2 pillars are very typical of transitional housing programs around the country. The first is maximizing safety, and the second is building trust. I have not talked with any transitional housing program in the country who wouldn't say that that's really important to them as well. The other 3 pillars are a little, maybe less common, and I want to talk about those in more depth. It's eliminating financial mandates. So they do not charge rent at Coburn Place while people are staying there, and eliminating any participation mandates. So everything is voluntary. They also have what we thought was really comprehensive and coordinated advocacy and programming. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. And then finally, we noticed that there was a real strong staff culture of self-determination, autonomy, empowerment, promotion from within, and growth. So those were the 5 pillars, and I'll just spend a tiny bit of time talking about each one so that you can then discuss all of this. So maximizing safety, and this is a quote from one of the survivors, basically the fact that you have somewhere safe to go, not being hit, and just, this is the best thing. It's surrounded, so no one can just walk in and out. And this is one of the things we've tried to stress with HUD that's particularly important for transitional housing with domestic violence survivors, is we've got some survivors where it just simply is not safe for them to have their own housing in the community. And this is according to them, not according to us. They will say, I will not be safe. I need to have these security systems in place, however that may look. And so that really came up a lot when we talked with staff and survivors, is that maximizing safety. Also the trust building. And again, every transitional housing program does this to some extent or another, but what I was impressed with Coburn Place in particular were 3 things. They really spent a lot of time thinking about separating staff roles. So for example, if somebody's an advocate for a survivor, they're not also the housing manager. So they're not going to be an advocate who also says, you're going to be evicted. You're not following the rules. They separate out people by their expertise. And I think that's a problem, in my opinion, that a lot of domestic violence agencies have, and a lot of that's due to lack of funding, is we expect staff members to be superheroes. They need to be really strong advocates and have great communication skills and empathy and active listening skills, and know everything about every system, legal systems, welfare systems, housing systems. And they need to be able to fundraise, and they need to be able to write grants. And I mean, it's just amazing what we expect people to have to do. And Coburn Place decided, we need somebody who's just going to be a housing advocate, who just really focuses on those relationships in the community with landlords and housing authorities and understands the rules and regulations. And that's their focus. And somebody else, their focus is going to be well-being. And they're going to focus on trauma and healing and health. And somebody else is going to focus on the children. So they've really made a sincere effort at trying to separate various staff roles. They also committed to flexible case management, where they really try to meet people where they are. They're very strengths-based. Their services, again, are voluntary. And so they try to work with each individual client on what is it you're looking for, what do you need, and how can I help you get there? And then, of course, we were just really impressed with the passion and compassion of the staff. And that, I will say, is outstanding, and also, I think, pretty typical of a lot of really wonderful transitional housing programs around the country, is if you don't have compassionate staff, you're not going to keep them, and they're not going to do a great job. So here was a great quote from a staff member. Advocates will never give lease violations because it needs to always be clear that they're on the client's side. The advocate can go to the lease violation meeting, but they will be an advocate for the client and not the program. So the third pillar is eliminating financial and participation mandates. And I loved this quote from a survivor who said, when we were asking about the services being voluntary and what she would feel like if she was mandated to participate in services. And her response was, I would feel like I was almost institutionalized if they tried to make me do something. I'm living here by choice. If they tried to tell me, you got to do this, you got to do this, then I'd probably end up leaving. And I think that's a really key quote from a survivor for all of us to think about. My own research and others have found a really strong connection that if a survivor does not feel like they're respected by staff, if they don't feel like they have choices, they will simply not participate, or they'll leave if they have any choices whatsoever. Some people stay because there is no other choice, but they're pretty unhappy in the program. So both staff and the survivors in the program talked about the importance of this voluntary model. Now, I know most people on this call also have a voluntary model because OVW, a number of funders mandate that we provide voluntary services. But some people are more voluntary than others, I guess I'll say. Sometimes there's a little bit of coercion about participating in services, and that's really not a pillar here at Coburn. Another piece of this that I found pretty unusual and I think is pretty important is that they not only eliminated participation mandates, but financial mandates. So a lot of transitional housing programs expect clients to pay a percentage of their income for their unit. And at Coburn Place, they used to do that. And then they spend a lot of time listening to survivors and listening to staff. And it was survivors telling them that it was harmful to them that they had to pay rent and how it made it more difficult for them to raise money to get a security deposit, to get that first month's rent. And Coburn Place listened. And they just decided that people could stay. And for those of you who don't know, at Coburn Place, you can stay up to 24 months, and it's completely rent-free. They have 35 apartment units. So this is not communal living. This really is independent transitional housing units where people can work with advocates to the extent that they want to. There are children's programs. There's all kinds of services available to them, but it is all voluntary, and they can stay up to 24 months. And I think, again, this was not a research project. We didn't compare them to another model, but for me, just common sense tells me that these are probably contributing to the incredible success that Coburn Place has. And then, the comprehensive and coordinated advocacy, I think, is also really important. I liked this quote by a survivor. I can see it because okay, hold on. They have different things going on in the community that they're in partnership with, or they're connected to in some way. So we're always invited to different events and different things going on in the community around holidays. And so that makes your holiday time enjoyable. You now start feeling a part of something, feeling cared about, feeling like you do matter. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this pillar and talking with staff about this pillar because their coordination and partnership is multi-pronged. It's important to them that they're in partnership with the survivors, but they also are in really strong partnership with so many community partners that they feel a very part of the community, and they want to make sure that community members feel a part of Coburn Place. They have an unbelievable number of volunteers at a time when I hear in most places that they can't get volunteers. What is often true is people saying everybody's working 2 jobs, everybody's too busy, they're not volunteering. And so we did actually spend some time with Coburn Place, and I said to them, other places can't get volunteers. You've got over 100 of them. What are you doing? And they can answer that better than I can, but they really did have a lot of answers around how they involve people, and they work to people's strengths and they involve people's strengths. So that was really, really impressive. And then finally, they have a strong culture of staff self-determination and growth. They want to hire from within. There's a lot of upward mobility. There's helping people learn new skills so that they can move into higher jobs if they want to. I noticed that people just got along really well. And we know how important that is in the workforce. We didn't have anybody backbiting each other behind closed doors. You didn't have the rumor mills going on. Now, obviously, we were only there to do interviews, but I will tell you, in some agencies, I can already hear it just even in those types of interviews. There was just a clear sense of respect for each other and a respect from management down to people doing direct service work, as much as there was from the people doing direct service work up to management. If very strong communication and sense of community. So I loved this quote from a staff member who said, "I can do outside the box non-traditional case management. I love that I can structure my case management for every single resident." And then she gave us a couple of examples. She said, a young lady from India didn't know anything about the busing system. We had to get out and learn how to ride the bus together. Or we have one lady who's working on some immigration things and getting a divorce, and we spent time in court last week. And, you know, some agencies are really good at this, and some agencies just are not. And this goes back to what are the protocols and what's allowed. Is, do staff feel like they're allowed and encouraged to go out in the community, to be away from their desk, to really work on whatever it is the survivor wants to work on? Do you really have that flexibility? How many advocates in how many agencies would go out and ride the bus together with the survivor and show them how that works? Some will, and that's fabulous. But some say, that's not my job. My job is to focus on domestic violence. And what was really clear to us throughout Coburn Place is they do not view people as domestic violence survivors. They view people as whole human beings for whom domestic violence is one issue. So we talked to people about the exiting process, and I just really liked this quote, the woman who said, when I left with my apartment. There's no program I've ever heard of where you leave and you can take everything with you, the furniture, the appliances, you can take everything. I will say when I shared this with the staff, they went, whoa, hold on, she meant the small appliances. They don't take the refrigerators and the stoves. They take like coffee makers. So, but they can take things and they're encouraged to take things. So they're not leaving to an empty apartment. They take what they can. They take beds, they take the linens. So she says, I was fortunate enough to be able to take my apartment so that for my girls, it was just like moving from one apartment to the next. It was still home. So they weren't missing out on anything. They may seem like small things. These are huge, just huge things to survivors. Now, let's talk about the challenges. This was not everything is, coming up roses at Coburn Place all the time. These are not folks who come riding in on unicorns to work in the morning. There are issues. And the issues that they generally talked about were two. That it's sometimes difficult to support change while promoting choice, right? I mean, for some people it's easy, but when you're wanting to talk about what needs to be different in your life, where are you going? What do you want to change? And really letting the person lead the way. Let's be honest, sometimes, we have different opinions about that, or we see that maybe things aren't working. So they talked about that this is sometimes difficult. And they had to talk about that with each other and as staff. And especially when there were mental health and substance abuse issues going on, right? And I think we have all dealt with that. And that's just an ongoing issue that we have, is how do you be survivor driven and really promote autonomy when you are sometimes dealing with people with serious mental health issues, substance abuse issues. So as one staff member said, some people just show that they need a little more push than others. Some people will have that desire and will run with it, and some need a bit more structure. So we did talk about that. You know, there are issues, there are problems, but like any good organization, they try to just communicate about those, talk about it head on. Staff talked about that they can share with each other without feeling like they're going to be shut down or criticized, that they can talk about these issues openly. So I think that has been really key at Coburn Place as well. So key components we think that lead to Coburn Place's success. Some of them are really typical of many DV transitional housing programs. They have very low barrier entry. They don't exclude people because of substance abuse, mental health issues, criminal records. So very low barrier entry, voluntary services, safety measures, and a strong children's program. I'd say those are pretty typical from around the country. What we thought were less typical was their service length flexibility and that it was up to 24 months. That they charge absolutely no rent, and that they separated the expertise of staff and specifically hired a housing advocate. Now, I'm not sure they still have that housing advocate because, as we all know, it sort of depends on what funding you have, from what stream, that what you're allowed. But at the time that we were there, this is how they had separated out: wellness advocates, housing advocates, children's advocates. And so the point is separating out that expertise and not expecting one person to necessarily know everything about everything. And then the staff culture, which I think is just critical for success with survivors, but also is critical for staff turnover. You know, we all know that staff turnover is extremely expensive for an organization. It also can really just throw a wrench in how services are delivered, how much work then falls on other people while that position gets filled. So staff culture, I think, needs a lot more attention than we sometimes give it. And we were very impressed with the staff culture. So I'll end with this quote from a woman who just was talking overall about Coburn Place and said, it's 360 degrees of wholeness. They want to make sure that from the time you get there to the time that you leave, you are adequately equipped with the tools you need to provide safe and stable housing and a safe and stable lifestyle for you and your children. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I'm going to open it up for questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. One thing really quickly before, we are going to have an open Q&A section. If you do have a question and you don't want to forget it, please do go ahead and put that in the chat now. Before we jump into that though, I do have some questions that I want to ask of you, Dr. Sullivan, and also Lily, one of our housing advocates at Coburn Place, before we get into the questions and answers for the whole group. So my first question for you, Cris, is why is a voluntary service model important to the success of transitional housing programs?
Well, and I think I mentioned that, you know, we know that if you try to mandate something that somebody doesn't want, they're going to either resist, they're not going to show up, but it's also really going to hurt their relationship with the staff. And I did a study on that with Anna Melvin a number of years ago, where we really found that in a transitional housing program in Michigan, that if survivors felt connected to the staff, they got so much out of the program and they would participate. But if they didn't, or if they felt patronized, condescended to, forced to do things, they just, you know, they didn't get as much out of it. They left as quickly as they could, and odds are they didn't have as great of outcomes.
Thank you. My next question, and you also touched on this a bit in the presentation, why aren't transitional housing programs more readily available? You mentioned that it was a HUD funding issue. Is that the majority of the reason?
Well, I think we are moving more toward trying to move people into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And as somebody who loves the domestic violence housing first model and loves the idea of getting people into permanent housing as quickly as possible. I'm all for that. But I will say I did a study a couple of years ago where we talked to people who were in a transitional housing program, and we asked them, if you could have moved into permanent housing immediately with the same kinds of supports, rent paid, advocacy, but you would have been in your own house in the community, if you'd had that option, would you have taken it? And a lot of people said yes, they would have. But a number of people said no because of safety issues, because they just would not have been safe in the community, or also because they needed time to heal in a place where they felt more protected and cared for. So these were people with extremely high trauma histories who, one woman said, I need time to be able to go to school and get a degree, and I can do that here because I've got people helping me and my kids are in childcare, and I wouldn't be able to do that out in the community. So, I'm all for having as many housing options as possible in our communities, but I do think that, especially for domestic violence victims, transitional housing done well is a great, great resource for people who really do have those particular needs.
Do you think that the funding providers providing funding for transitional housing programs and other types of housing programs, you mentioned that, you were trying to highlight with them how important safety still is and how that needs to be included in the housing option, regardless of length of time. Do you feel like that there's anything that organizations can do to be better prepared when appealing for those funding options of laying out more safety protocol options and more costs on spending on safety? What might that look like?
Well, what I've been trying to do as part of the movement is building the evidence base, because that's often what I'm hearing from the feds is, where's the evidence, right? Because we get evidence in other areas that transitional housing isn't working. So where's your evidence that it is working? So that's one reason we did the Coburn Place study, where we did the other study, which was done in Austin, Texas. We did a study in Michigan. But I think that we just have to keep explaining that we're different. And I know the feds get tired of always hearing us go, but we're different, but we are different. And so I think we just have to keep stressing that, and probably what agencies can do, since you can't do research studies, but you can pull out those stories. Pull out the stories from your clients about why they need transitional housing versus permanent housing for a time. Because I do think the stories can be very compelling.
Thank you. My next question is actually for both you, Dr. Sullivan, and also Lily, our housing advocate. So Dr. Sullivan, I'll let you answer first. What's something a survivor has said to you that has stuck with you for a long time?
Boy, I hear so many things from survivors, as we all do, that I'll never forget. I think what always sticks with me is when a survivor says, you're the first person who's ever just listened to me and believed me. Or when they say to a staff member, you're the first person that I could tell this to, and that who is listening to me and doing what I'm asking you to do. That always sticks with me.
Yeah.
Especially since we work with survivors that have often been in the system for years and years and years. So to hear them say that, I think to any of us, that's something that doesn't leave you.
Yeah, what a memorable connection too. Lily, what about you? What's something that a survivor has said to you that has stuck with you?
So I had one client who, it was actually recently, during the insane beginning stress of COVID, who was housed through us. And she said it in a way that really stuck with me, in that she said, thanks to you guys, thanks to you, I've been able to find my identity again. And it just really highlights that importance of housing. And as Lauren said, I'm a housing advocate. So having that just somewhere to go, and that's what she was saying, was having somewhere that I stayed at night, gave her time to step out of crisis for a moment and really remember who she was. And that was really special.
Lily, my second question for you, that's actually a great transition into this, because Dr. Sullivan addressed in her presentation some of the most common barriers that she sees to housing for people or long-term permanent housing success. I was wondering, in your experience, what you've seen as the most common barrier to housing for survivors that you work with at Coburn Place.
So I think the broadest barrier that I've seen is income. Either a need to build income, a need to be able to pay off debts, whether they're evictions, whether they're license reinstatements, whether they're utility bills, having time to pay those or build the income to pay those before then. Okay, now I also need rent and I also need a security deposit and pay my current bills. So that would be something that I think Dr. Sullivan kind of mentioned on that, not having rent. It gives them opportunities to pay for other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you feel like that's, by the time someone leaves the programming at Coburn Place, that a lot of those initial income related barriers are able to be addressed either through employment or through connecting them with other services and things like that?
I think it's definitely a lot of times we can get a large part of it worked out, whether it's, like you said, from their employment. We're very fortunate to have amazing grant writers and an amazing development team who gets us lots of money to help the clients. And sometimes, we can help them figure out how do I contact this landlord and try to settle this eviction instead of I need to pay all of this money.
Yeah. And Lily, my final question for you, you're a housing advocate, but as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, our whole team at Coburn Place works together very closely. So do you feel like you see similarities or differences between housing advocacy and well-being advocacy? And what are some of those distinctions?
Yeah, and I'll apologize. My dog will be in the background for part of this. It's evening and everyone's outside, so
it's okay. My cat's right next to me, so I keep on like shoving him in the face so he doesn't walk in the screen.
Yeah, this is his loudest time of day is 5:30 to 7. But I do think that having the different advocates is so special for the clients that we work with. Not only as my job as a housing advocate, I can focus on kind of one part of their need. But the other thing that I can do is, since we've worked with Dr. Sullivan, we actually have added a whole team of housing advocates. And so we're able to go out in the community and build those landlord relationships. We also participate with the Continuum of Care in Indianapolis. And so we're also building connections with other housing service providers that we have more time to focus on because they also have another advocate who's working with kind of what I would say is their wraparound, their holistic services, which would be the well-being department.
Great answer. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to open it up to anybody can ask questions of either Cris or Lily. If you are able, I highly recommend turning your camera on and shifting to gallery mode so we can see and interact with each other a little bit more. I did notice that in the chat, let's see, Sabrina asked, for smaller programs with limited staff, do you have specific staff roles that you think must be separated? I'm guessing that's for you, Cris.
Well, I'm actually going to defer to Lily on that because I feel like you're the ones on the ground doing this. So what would you all say? Other, right? There's a lot of people from around the country and a lot of small programs. So I'm sure a lot of people have thoughts on this.
And as a lot of people do at Coburn or in various domestic violence or interpersonal abuse organizations. I came from another domestic violence organization. I worked in a shelter setting before I came to Coburn Place. And I think it was really cool coming to Coburn Place and seeing the housing advocate position built out and separate. Because in my shelter experience, the case managers definitely had good input to housing, but they didn't have the time or the resources to dedicate to purely housing. And so, yes, a part of their case management would have been, let's talk about what your housing goals. Again, they were in shelter, so it was even shorter term than transitional housing, but they didn't have the time to, I can go with my clients to an apartment showing. I can go with them to a lease signing. I can go with them to multiple apartment showings if they go somewhere and this doesn't feel safe. Actually, I don't really think this is going to work for my family or for me. I can go with them and explain those things too. The other part is I can advocate for them to their landlords or to property managers that they're applying for, and I can help explain all of these things that I might just not have time if I was also trying to do well-being. And so I think prioritizing a housing advocate would have been really special even in the shelter that I was working in, which was in a smaller location than Indianapolis. So I think that from my experience, that would have been a really important role.
I do actually want to jump in. I think that's a brilliant answer, Lily. And I will tell you that when I first started learning more about transitional housing programs in the domestic violence realm, I was honestly shocked at how many of them don't help people get housed. I just assumed that transitional housing programs helped people get housed because we all know it's transitional, right? People have to leave. And so I assumed that was always a key role. And I can't tell you how many programs, when you ask them, what are the services you provide? They provide counseling and legal advocacy and support groups and childcare and blah, blah, blah. But when you say, well, do you help people get housed? They say, well, we talk to them about that their deadlines are coming up. And I was just shocked by that. I really was shocked at how many transitional housing programs do not help people eliminate the barriers that are keeping them from getting housed and help them do everything that Lily just said. So I would have to agree. And I love that you also said, even for shelters too, we all know we've got a lot of people in shelter who do not need to be there. They no longer need to be there because of safety. We all know that, but there's nowhere for them to go. And so it just seems to make sense to me that we put a little bit more time into really helping people deal with the housing barriers that they have and find that housing and work with landlords and everything else.
And I want to add one other thing really quickly. Actually, like Lily mentioned, since Dr. Sullivan and her team came to Coburn Place, we have hired more housing advocates, but in addition, we've separated some of those responsibilities out even more. So the housing advocates work with the survivors on finding transitional housing in the short term, whether that's transitional housing in our building or out in the community. And then from there, once they leave our programming, what is their permanent housing situation going to look like? But for things like leasing violations, compliance issues, we actually have a separate position even that deals with that. So the housing advocates can build that trust with their survivors and talk about housing options and wanting to set them up for the most success possible without having to do any of the potentially, like punitive feeling sort of activities. I think I did see one other question from Sabrina. Oh, I just lost it. Have you seen as much success in transitional housing programs that offer scattered site locations?
We actually don't have enough research on that. I will tell you just from talking with people who have scattered site versus apartment building is what it seems to come down to is, do you have the staff who will go out to those scattered sites and offer services to make sure that people are getting the services that they need. And often, unfortunately, you don't see that. So if somebody is in an apartment building, it's easier to be available to them. But the scattered site, unfortunately, you often hear staff going, call me if you need me. Let me know if you need anything. And I will tell you, I have done research on people after they leave programs and out in the community. And the one thing I hear so consistently from survivors is, I wish they would reach out to me. I just wish somebody would contact me. And I know that programs think, well, I don't want to, interfere with this person's life. I don't want to be an imposition. We always tell them, you reach out to us. And that's not what survivors want. They don't want to have to ask for help all the time. None of us wants to ask for help. So I feel like scattered site can be fabulous, but only if you've also got the staff working with those folks to make sure, are you feeling supported enough? Can we get you to where you need to be? Are you isolated? And that's, as we know, it's very expensive and time consuming and difficult. But that's the downside to scattered site, is often I'll hear people feeling isolated.
I do, we have a couple of questions in the chat. There's one very lengthy question from Rachel, and we're going to come back to that, but I want to go to a question from Hope Shores Alliance because it is also still about scattered sites. They ask, can you talk about client engagement that has worked with scattered sites? Anything that you've seen that you've felt like is a good idea?
Yeah, it is the staff being more proactive and really talking with survivors about what is it you want and what's keeping you from getting there. Again, if it's scattered site, how are they getting to support groups? How are they getting their kids to be able to be with other kids or childcare? How are they getting to all of the different community events that you're putting on? So I think we have to make sure that we've got the resources available to just say, I get that you're out here by yourself. Mm-hmm. And making sure that our scattered sites are on public transportation systems and that type of thing. So
yes,
it's been my experience.
Yes. Next, I'm going to read Rachel's question, but Rachel, I also encourage you to feel free to chime in if you want also. Rachel says, on more than one occasion, survivors who have exited our on-site transitional housing program and obtained permanent housing and increased household income have given feedback and asked us why we don't make them participate in activities or case management. While our program has voluntary services, it does make me wonder how to weave our voluntary services approach with this request from survivors to require participation. Don't worry, I'm not suggesting that TH programs require participation, because we do see the value in establishing trusting relationships with survivors and think outside the box case management styles. We can absolutely understand that survivors can simply need one thing, housing, and that's okay. We also know that there are survivors who reach out for help, then stop answering our calls, texts, door knocks for long stretches of time. Survivors who have exited tell us that's when we need you most, when we shut down. This is a loaded question, I know, but any suggestions or advice or even a link?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is very complicated. I mean, we all know we're going to hear all kinds of things from different survivors. You work with enough survivors, you're going to hear people say, you need to have more rules. You need to have rules about this and that and this and that. And you need to mandate services and you have to do this. That's always going to be there. And I think it's just important to explain again why we don't do that. And I agree with you that it's a really tough call when you want to reach out to people and they don't answer your call. Does that mean you're irritating them and you need to stop? Or does it mean they really need you even more? Mm-hmm. And the only thing I can say is that that's where the relationship comes in. I think about this wonderful program where the staff member knew this participant had a serious alcohol addiction and had been sober for a while and then stopped coming to group. And she just knew this woman had started drinking again and started reaching out, and it was really difficult, but she just knew the woman was embarrassed and felt like she would be, thrown out of the program. And this staff member just, founder just kept at it and said to her, it happens. It's okay. I'm here for you. I love you. You know, we have programs where you're not allowed to say I love you. And this was a program that they actually were encouraged to say I love you. And this was something that was really important to that particular survivor. But it's always a judgment call. And we all know if we've been doing this long enough, sometimes we get it wrong. And sometimes we get it right. And I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that, but that's all I would say.
Thank you. And thank you, Rachel, for asking. Let's see. Cheyenne asks, I know you have mentioned there are multiple housing advocates at Coburn Place. Could you provide an example of how many tenants each housing advocate has? I'm assuming that means in their caseload. Lily?
Yeah, so how our housing advocates work right now is we actually work with all types of clients. Coburn Place has on-site transitional housing. We have short-term rental assistance through rapid rehousing, and we also have general outreach work that we do. If there's a client who's working through another housing system, like our local housing authority, or if they just needed guidance and assistance, but they didn't need that funding piece. So on-site, right now, our advocates, I think we all have around 7 to 10 clients, and we have a couple more, or at least one more, I think, housing advocate coming in. And so our caseloads will be changing a little bit, so it's hard to say exactly where we're at. But on site, we're pretty spread out. So I know right now I have, I think, 7.
Thank you, Lily. We have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Is there anybody else who would either like to post in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask?
I wanted to add that one question that I thought of when I was reading Cheyenne's question was, how many advocates does a survivor actually have at Coburn Place? And I thought that that was an interesting layer that's constantly changing at Coburn Place because our structure is evolving as we hear from survivors what they need. But typically a survivor has a well-being advocate and a housing advocate. They work with the property compliance specialist that is the one that would give them the tour of Coburn Place when they arrive, show them the fitness center. Is in a lot of ways their landlord. That doesn't really mean anything at Coburn Place, but just the logistics of their staying in our on-site CH housing. They also have the children's advocacy team if they have kids. And then they have a range of support outside of that, whether that's our VP of Mission Impact or just our Intake and Wellbeing Services Coordinator or our Housing Services Coordinator. You know, they have that upper level that I know sometimes when we have clients and survivors that have a lot of needs, sometimes those get shifted up to those upper levels so that they can have more one-on-one time with those survivors. But we also have a 24-hour-a-day staffing at our front desk. And a lot of times that's where relationships also build, is in that mentor role, is what we call that position. And so literally, 24 hours a day, there is someone, which I'm sure is very similar across the board at all of these fantastic organizations. But as I was puzzling that out in my head, reading Cheyenne's question, I thought, wow, survivors have a lot of touch points. And the reason for that is because we have gotten a lot of feedback from them that having those separate relationships are really important.
And I'll add on to with Julie's comment. My role with Coburn Place is fairly new. I'm in my 3rd week as the housing coordinator. Work very closely with Lily and the other team members. And one of the pieces to celebrate is the identifying the separate roles, so that each survivor that comes in contact with Coburn Place has a team of individuals working with her, him, their family, to coordinate, support services and from children's services to housing to well-being. And the communication is incredible. From, if Lily has identified with the survivor that the well-being advocate needs to be involved, then she will coordinate with the well-being advocate. So it's been pretty incredible to witness just in the short period of time I've been with them, but very much appreciate that as a team approach.
Thanks.
I
Tina,
just
and welcome.
I want to say for those agencies out there shaking their heads right now going, we are so far from this. Like, we just do not have that kind of staffing. They're just luckier than we are. They're bigger than we are. Coburn didn't go from 0 to 100 overnight. And I wish Julia were here. And I hope that at some point Coburn Place does a webinar on how that movement happened, because it really was like having a philosophy and then making movement over time. And, that then builds to getting more funding, and that builds to getting more funding and more attention and more community support. So it's not like, I just don't want people feeling like, well, you're just so much bigger than we are. We could never do that. It's a process.
And I know we have to wrap up, but I also want to say that our donors are just the backbone and the foundation of how we've been able to diversify funding and create these different roles. And there are donors on this call, and I just want to say, we appreciate you. You are incredible, and you're making the mission happen. You make all of this possible. Thank you so much. It was so fun to see so many names.
And I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, in true nonprofit problems fashion, we have one Zoom account, and we actually have a survivors group meeting that is supposed to be starting right now. So I apologize if we did not get to your questions. If you have more, please email me. You all have my email now, and I will follow up with links to Dr. Sullivan's team's presentation, her study on us, and also an infographic. So thank you all so much for coming again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to Dr. Cris Sullivan for joining us, and to Lily for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.